The Clown Puppet, a Case Study, an essay by Michael Cisco. No one doubts that Ligotti's work is weird fiction, but can we say how? What does it mean to categorize a story by genre? There are a number of questions that can help us approach an answer. Attempts to define genres often founder when they try to fix the genre's attributes. But how else can we think of a genre? One approach would be to see genre, weird fiction in Ligotti's case, as something a story reproduces instead of a category to which the story belongs. Each story has its own particular canon and reproduces its genre. Weird fiction does this by repeating and addressing certain concerns. Is reality stable? Is the supernatural a transcendent order? Is identity stable? Is there a bizarre event in the story? Is there a contrast between a bizarre aesthetic effect and the aesthetic conventions of fiction outside the genre? Does the story involve bizarre signs? Does the story involve an idea of destiny as self-aware? Now, let's apply these questions to a story by Ligotti, The Clown Puppet, selected at random. In this story, the unnamed narrator is working late one night at a medicine shop owned by a Mr. Wisniak when a puppet figure, whom the speaker has seen numerous times before, appears to him and then, presumably, absconds with Mr. Wisniak. The speaker is an auditory witness to the disappearance. Mr. Wisniak seems to recognize the puppet and is withdrawn from existence in much the way a marionette on stage is pulled up out of sight by its strings. The story's canon brings together H.P. Lovecraft, M.R. James, and E.T.A. Hoffman, all prominent writers of weird fiction. Ligotti introduces into this combination the style of Thomas Bernard, whose work is not weird fiction. The story is written largely in a version of Bernard's style, turned toward the purposes of weird fiction. From Lovecraft, he takes some aspects of setting, the derelict town, but more importantly, he takes a certain problem involving cosmic indifference. Ligotti once told me that his favorite story by M.R. James was The Story of a Disappearance and an Appearance, which revolves around a Punch and Judy show. The puppet imagery in The Clown Puppet connects to this imagery, and the title of the James story could also just as readily be applied to this one. Finally, Hoffman provides us with the figure of Mr. Wisniak, who seems to be a demoralized version of one of Hoffman's adept characters, such as Counselor Crespel. From Hoffman as well come the significance of gestures, and even a kind of dancing in the story. The Clown Puppet reproduces the genre of weird fiction by combining these elements in the service of a new story involving a new kind of narration. Reality is presented in the story as unstable, in that it is at once an illusion and yet something that no amount of disillusionment can escape. That is, it is a dream without a waking, real life to compare itself to. The supernatural element in the story would be the visit by the puppet. That this is not a hallucination is clear, because Mr. Wisniak also sees the red gold light that heralds the visit, and the question of hallucination is productively undermined by the more sinister implication that the visit is anomalous only insofar as it is not really anomalous. More on this later. The supernatural in the story does reflect a transcendent order, but Ligotti escapes the reassurance that normally is associated with the idea of such an order by insisting that it is empty or nonsense. To put it another way, there is sense, but not for us. The only sense is that there is no sense. Sense is only an illusion. Identity seems to work in the same way, and, as is often the case, the sense of life and the world is regarded as the pillar of identity, so that an attack on the former likewise undermines the latter. There is plainly a bizarre event, the visit, although this is less an anomaly in contrast to normal everyday events, considering how generally low-key, dreamlike the story is, and more a contrast between this visit and previous ones. There is a contrast between a bizarre aesthetic effect and the conventional expectations of a story. This is a weird tale in which the harbinger of doom comes not for the narrator, but for someone else. The main aesthetic effect, however, is the very atypical division between horror, which is present in the story, and fear, which only affects Mr. Wisniak. The speaker, on the other hand, is not afraid, but outraged, and that outrage is the story's chief emotional affect. The bizarre event is manifestly a sign. The puppet is an emissary, operated by strings. Is there anyone or anything pulling the strings? Finally, destiny appears as something self-aware in the story, insofar as the narrator is complicit with the story. We are told that, as far as he knows, he will receive only one visit in any given location. After each visit, he changes his location, without any apparent compulsion to do so. If he did not change locations, then there would be no further visits, so his evidently voluntary relocations seem to be intended to ensure that the visits continue. This suggests that the narrator is involved in the events of the story in the same elusive way that the dreamer is with the origin of the dream. This must be the case because the dream must not come from outside the dreamer. If it did, then the story would lose efficacy. It would become the story of someone oppressed by a curse imposed from outside, which would then have to be explained if the story were to be satisfactory as a story. But that is not what this story is. Instead, the dream must involve the dreamer so that his identity itself is undermined. The victim of an inimical force is neatly defined as an individual by persecution, and this is not what is happening here. What we are to fear is not some random encounter with a malicious curse, but our own intangible reality as selves. Reading the story more closely, we begin with the title, which situates the story at the intersection of one set of weird tales involving human effigies and another set that involves clowns, although a clown may be defined as a kind of human effigy. The first line remodels opening sentences like Lovecraft's quote, "Life is a hideous thing," from Arthur German, and Poe's quote, "Misery is manifold," from Berenice. It is the statement of a philosophical thesis that the events of the story will bear out. Here we can appreciate the cumulative effect of the consistency of a writer like Ligotti, in that anyone familiar with his work will, on reading these words, suspect that it's the clown puppet speaking them, and even if it isn't, whoever is speaking them will turn out to be no different from a clown puppet. That is, a helpless mockery of a free human being. The first line states that the speaker is outraged by the failure of existence to make sense, or perhaps by the mocking appearance of sense existence presents, as if existence were real only insofar as it tricked you into believing it was real. Lovecraft worked up a parallel double bind. The monstrous gods who personify the impersonality of the cosmos, who are indifferent to mankind, but not completely. They seem to want to humiliate mankind by rubbing it in, but then that means they aren't indifferent to mankind. Thomas Bernhard, the Austrian writer, developed a unique prose style involving the repetition of phrases with minor modifications. Bernhard's repetition has a way of sustaining focus on an idea while turning it, so to speak, this way and that, making it a kind of rhetorical sculpture that can be examined from a number of different sides. This gives us an affect too of precision and insistence. It looks the same no matter what your point of view is. Therefore, it is the way it looks. The speaker adopts a position that is completely superior to reality, indicating it as a fraud, but not in the name of any superior sense. The speaker has no superior idea of reality, but is a superior reality. Reality fails to live up to him, to his standard of sense, and while the speaker can adopt any distance, from intimate to remote, the speaker is free, at least at this point, to survey all possible points of view. The narrator speaks as the embodiment of reality itself. As the narrative begins, it remains to be seen whether that freedom of movement in perspective will endure, or whether the speaker will be beguiled again and become fixed. This is the conflict of the story, and the danger comes in the form of the visits. The visits are bizarre signs. In this case, they are a volatile mixture of banality and the ironically self-aware employment of carefully selected tropes from weird fiction, like Mr. Wisniak, the man with the slightly fantastic, exotic name, who seems to bring an aura of strangeness into the ordinary with him, and the mysterious shop which brings strangeness into the domain of business. The shop isn't a drugstore or a pharmacy, it's a medicine store. This is a very deft and elegant way to create a dreamlike sense around the story. Simply refer to things by off names. The shop only minimally qualifies as a shop, since it is situated in an out-of-the-way place, and it is very small. Mr. Wisniak lives above it, and so that conserves the footprint of the bazaar in an urban setting whose ordinariness can be assumed insofar as it is not really described in any detail. Two weird spots, a shop and a home in two different locations, would already go too far toward making the city or town itself fantastical, and so the contrast would be weakened. Mr. Wisniak doesn't care if the shop is illuminated at night, or even if it is opened or closed. This implies that the shop fulfills its purpose simply by being there. And this is entirely at odds with the logic of any commercial enterprise. Businesses grow. They don't try to remain as small as possible. It appears Mr. Wisniak has hired the narrator only for his own benefit, to distract him from his nonsense, not with sense, but with absence. The store doesn't make sense as a store. The peculiar sympathy between the speaker and Mr. Wisniak suggests, if not that they are the same person, something perhaps more radical, in that their being different persons amounts to no real difference. Continuity has already told us that Mr. Wisniak is one of Ligotti's Hoffman-like agents of empty revelations, so his special knowledge is likely the truth of the story. He is an agent of the fictionalness of the story, and he knows it, or will realize it. The point here is that Ligotti is comparing the life you live right now, dear listener, with the tenuous, obviously phony existence of characters in stories. Characters who aren't even especially plausible as characters. That, by means of a brilliant artistic turn, becomes the verisimilitude of the characters. They resemble us in their unrealness. Across the street, there is the meat store, not a butcher shop. Just like the medicine store, this place has a willfully cruder name that is reinforced by the simple illuminated nouns, beef, pork, goat, that are among the only lights in the scene. This might have less to do with any notion that human life is just merely physical and fleshy, and more to do with the idea that this deliberate crudeness makes the scene more plausibly physical by drawing our attention to the unreality of even our physical experience of life. Both the stores have something to do with death. Death nonsense is the worst, perhaps because with death there is strictly nothing to speak about at all. The freer we are to speak about something, that is, the more unconstrained we are by that thing, the more nonsensical what we will say about it will be. So, if we maintain that the absence of life is the least of what we can experience, then perhaps we are least constrained when we discuss it. And so, anything we say is extravagant. Ligotti's style is extravagantly anti-extravagant. That's how he has his cake and eats it too. That's part of the unique pleasure of reading him. So, we have a medicine shop, a meat shop, a medicine room, a toilet, and only in the toilet is there an opportunity for a character who cannot abide nonsense to collect himself. This seems like an evacuative, self-derogatory comment, although all these places involve bodies. I collect myself in the shitter, so what does that make me? The visit is so nonsensical that it makes the nonsensicality of reality obvious, which is why the speaker seems to privilege it. The visitor cheats so outrageously that the puppet's deception acts as a revelation instead. Each visit prompts a departure that only appears to be a change, changing locations, setting, personnel, all the elements of a real scene, but without the effect of actual change. And this reinforces the idea that everywhere the speaker only confronts the same seamlessly joined, lying essence, one from which he vainly distinguishes himself. The figure appears without any physical mechanism, but this probably has less to do with the traditional difficulty in distinguishing between actual events and hallucinations that we find in a great deal of weird fiction, and more to do with establishing the illusory nature of actual events. The sound the puppet makes, which corresponds with its transit across his field of vision, causes its appearance to be addressed to the speaker, since it seems to be interacting with his field of vision. The puppet's fixed expression gives us the problem that the indifference and senselessness of reality does not strike human beings as mere neutrality, but as a deliberate callousness, as if sense and care were not non-existent, but deliberately withheld from mankind, and therefore possible. This is the most Lovecraftian element of this story. The odd digression about motions seems to be included in part to reinforce the idea of action without an actor, or of events without being, or of reality being a performance. The quotation may be invented. It introduces a tone of parochial narrowness into the story, which seems to contrast with the nihilism of the speaker. There is no alarm. The explanation is matter of fact. So, we see this isn't about fear, but about horror without fear. The puppet is nightmarish, but the speaker is indifferent. So, where is the indifference? In the cosmos or in the speaker? The speaker is called upon to go through the motions of his own activity, here being a counterman at a drugstore, and so we can see this is why the visits are always associated with the performance of a specific duty rather than home visits. The motions you go through in a simple job are stereotyped and impersonal in a way that domestic activity, while perhaps just as mechanical and or arbitrary, is personal. The self-awareness of the story emerges mainly in irony. The puppet is an effigy, so it has no proper identification. The closest thing it has to an identity would be the identity of the one who pulls the strings. But there is no indication that any such being exists. Finally, emotion occurs, but it is anxiety, or something like anger, rather than fear. By presenting Mr. Wisniak's passport, however distorted, the puppet seems to be claiming to own the store, to be the speaker's employer. So, this suggests a kind of endgame, that the truth is about to come out, that everything is a farce. And this is when the speaker becomes angry, and when Ligotti chooses to introduce Mr. Wisniak. He enters as the puppet leaves, and it becomes apparent that the medicine store should be visualized as a Punch and Judy style puppet booth, with the characters coming and going as they do on stage, from left to right, disappearing behind curtains. This puts the speaker in the position of either the puppeteer or the audience. Mr. Wisniak hears sounds in his room above, and the puppet seems to have descended the stairs to enter the store. So, this makes his room into something like the upper regions of a puppet stage where the puppets are stored. Mr. Wisniak beckons with a hand motion, like the puppet, and the speaker is primarily struck by the idea that another person is unprecedentedly entering into one of his visits. But is Mr. Wisniak another person? That the puppet should identify itself as Mr. Wisniak and then vanish as he appears suggests that they are not different. It seems we are being prepared for the revelation of Mr. Wisniak as the puppet, or puppet master. This is another way in which the story participates in the genre of weird fiction, by playing off of expectations of this kind. The speaker addresses his employer, but not as an employee. He speaks to Mr. Wisniak as if they were related. In a dreamlike touch, Mr. Wisniak seems to be coming into the shop from his bed, since he is not dressed for the street, but he enters from the street. The narrator tells him to go back to bed, presumably so that he will not encounter the puppet. This is one of the few acts by the speaker that reflect any volition at all. Is this because he wishes to protect Mr. Wisniak, or is it because he wants the visits to be his alone? Given the implications of the story so far, an encounter between Mr. Wisniak and the puppet would most likely result in the collapse of reality around the speaker, a final confirmation of nothingness, which is constant relocation after each visit seems intended to fend off. However, the speaker does not try to vigorously prevent Mr. Wisniak from entering the store. His resistance is not pronounced or intense. He seems to be weighed down by an overpowering existential fatigue. It may be that he is getting tired of the farce or of his part in the play. On the other hand, Mr. Wisniak is genuinely afraid. Does his secret knowledge extend to his own unreality as a character in a story? His face is like a mask. His eyes are bright with fear. The puppet fulfills much the same function as a harbinger of death. But its appearance doesn't really herald death. Death is also nonsense. Perhaps this is something to do with the meat store. The puppet is a harbinger of the unreality of life, and, hence, also of death. This is the problem here for Ligotti aesthetically, infusing intensity into a deflating experience. How can there be any sense of danger involving a being whose existence is false? By being neutral and inert, the narrator is better able to blend with the reader to vicariously threaten the reader's own complacent sense of being real. Mr. Wisniak sees the strange light, which confirms that the visit is not an experience for the speaker only. He speaks tonelessly. This detail, with the prior reference of a mask, augments the sense of impersonality around him. It seems he is losing concrete particularity. He retraces the steps of the puppet, and the repetition of the verb brushed to describe the sound of his footsteps after he used the word himself to describe the sound of what was presumably the puppet going down the stairs connects the two. Reading this, the genre reader begins to anticipate a climactic explosion of some kind coming from the rear of the shop. Perhaps the horrifying climax is the realization that there is nothing special about being visited, that those who see the nonsense for what it is are in the privileged position of being in on the joke, as opposed to the ignorant masses. Once off stage, Mr. Wisniak is whisked away like a puppet being yanked up out of sight on its strings. The foreboding this story creates then has to do with the supposition that we are all dangling from strings that are not only being jerked around, but can be yanked, pulling us into oblivion in a way that only suggests a reason or destiny, but which might as readily be purely senseless. Ligotti clearly and directly homes in on the instability of reality in the story without any detour through a plausible landscape. The concentrated force of the story would be dissipated if there were any carefully assembled real events to be undermined later by the arrival of the puppet. That plausible reality would be conjured only to be subverted anyway. This story comes from a place where it is no longer possible or worthwhile to conjure up a plausible reality to undermine. This is one of Ligotti's key innovations in weird fiction. He begins with the unreal and unwraps it within itself. The effect of this is to treat plausible reality as something already so blatantly compromised that it is no longer possible to create a passable facsimile of it in a story. It isn't necessary, and it may not be possible to create the house of cards you intend to knock down. By starting with the unreal, Ligotti turns what is often in weird fiction an all-or-nothing binary distinction between real and unreal into a continuum of escalating unreality. This affords creative room to explore unreality without having to invest in a version or idea of reality that is no longer viable. Having done this, Ligotti can then achieve bizarre effects by amplifying banality so that the shocking discovery we have come to expect as genre readers is the unveiling of the ordinary as just the ordinary. Part of the problem with artistic depictions of unreal experiences is that they are easily subsumed under one or another category, such as the hallucination or the supernatural. The event here in the clown puppet is supernatural in that it is plainly not some technological trickery or neurological snafu. The speaker doesn't have the psychological intricacies of a Poe narrator or the traumas of a Hoffman character, so it doesn't stand to reason that the visits would arise out of his weird mental state. Ligotti's supernatural does have a philosophical consistency in its nihilism. It may be that the emptiness of his supernatural compensates for its logic. The puppet is no surprise, not to anyone who encounters it, except insofar as it is strange for a nonsense cosmos to send an emissary to someone to announce that it is nonsense. The puppet is not bringing about an apocalypse or a prophetic judgment. Its arrival is more like the realization of a truth that no one has the strength to deny any longer. The concept of nothing is still something, and so we must distinguish between the concept of nothing and the absence of being. To the extent that nothingness can be treated as something other than an identity, Ligotti unmakes identity. Ligotti's identities, in this story and elsewhere, do exist insofar as they must, in order to realize they are illusory. This may be why the speaker has an ordinary attitude toward bizarre things. The closed, normal world turns out never to have been normal or closed, although Ligotti's vision is always closed, so, in a way, he weaponizes the idea of the world being closed. He doesn't open the closed world. He shows that the world is completely closed. This is another important innovation on his part, in this and other stories, largely by virtue of his exquisitely crafted tone of perfectionistic resignation. The revelation of a destiny always takes a closed form.